Welcome to Teaching Artist Podcast, a show dedicated to discussions of teaching art to kids, making art, and how those things overlap and feed each other. I'm Rebecca Potts, your host, a visual arts teaching artist. Don't miss our show, Catharsis, at exhibit.teachingartistpodcast.com. Juried by Chloe Alexander, it features the work of 19 artists and includes brief videos, several of them made, about their ideas, process, and advice for aspiring artists. Maria Coit, my partner in this gallery project, has also created 2 lesson plans to accompany the show. We would love to hear feedback if you share the exhibit with your students or use the lesson plans. We will also be doing studio visits live on Instagram each weekend throughout the run of the show, which ends March 19th. So be sure you're following us, Teaching Artist Podcast and Curated for Kids, to join those live studio visits. Okay, today's episode is a little bit long, so I'm going to get to it. Adding Voices began as a free virtual conference for art educators of color and allies, founded by Flavia Zuñiga-West. Soon after the first conference, one of the presenters, Snyder, came on board as a co-organizer for future conferences and an editor and contributor to the Patreon resources. Their newsletter for patrons is almost a misnomer. It's more like a beautifully designed virtual magazine with clickable links, curated images, articles, and carefully developed lesson plans that include pre-learning resources for art educators and contextual information about the artists they feature. It was such a pleasure talking with Flavia and Sydney and seeing their dynamic. I love how both of them resisted becoming teachers, despite it sort of being in their bones. It was wonderful to hear more about their art practices as well as their paths to teaching and to creating Adding Voices. We got into questions of conceptual work versus craft and why they're often pitted against each other. Patriarchy. We talked about identity and the planting and harvesting of self. Flavia talked beautifully about her children and the process of parenting and teaching as being akin to sculpture, gently shaping these individuals. This episode is a bit long, but it is so worth it. Flavia Zuñiga-West is a full-time middle school visual arts teacher at an independent school in Los Angeles, California. She has been teaching for 9 years and is a speaker, advocate, and mama of 2. She has worked with the American Alliance of Museums and has taught art in elementary, middle, and high school classrooms. She earned her MA in Museum Studies from New York University and her BFA in Drawing and Painting from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Flavia utilizes frameworks such as critical multiculturalism, critical race theory, and Black feminist theory to develop pedagogical and curricular strategies for art education. She is the founder of the Adding Voices Conference, the first ever conference to focus solely on issues of culturally responsive pedagogy in the visual arts, and to create a community for art educators of color and allies. Flavia is a curriculum writer, presenter, artist, and advocate who co-authors Adding Voices Patreon with Snyder, which offers a newsletter and curriculum focusing on anti-racist, culturally responsive art pedagogy. Most recently, Flavia was a keynote speaker at Moore College of Art and Design discussing the practice and theory of culturally responsive teaching in the art classroom. Snyder is an artist and art educator living in Los Angeles, California. She oversees a tab choice-based studio at an inclusive model school where learners of all physical and intellectual abilities work side by side all day. This is Sydney's 3rd year teaching in a tab studio and 10th year teaching art in a school setting. Sydney also works as a co-conspirator at Adding Voices, creating curriculum resources, editing newsletters, and organizing events. She brings her experience in inclusive model education and adaptive arts to the resources shared through Adding Voices. In her own studio practice, Sydney currently enjoys working with glitter, yarn, felt, and dye to create happy, soft, colorful, and sparkly works. Sydney often shares free curriculum resources for teachers, parents, and young artists on her website under Teaching Resources. Okay, let's hear from them. I am excited to be here talking with both of you. I'm here with Sydney Snyder and Flavia Zuñiga-West. And you both started, well, Flavia started, and then Sydney has joined an organization called Adding Voices that is just incredible. So I'm hoping we can fit in kind of talking about both of you individually as teachers and artists, and also Adding Voices. To get started, just a little bit of each of your background. And I usually ask how you became a teacher and how you became an artist and what roles both of those play and how they kind of interact. Flavia, do you want to jump in?
Hi, I'm so excited we were finally able to do this. It makes me happy. Let's see, those are big questions.
Yes.
So how I became a teacher? Technically speaking, I never planned to become a teacher. I'm a second generation teacher. So my mother and father are both teachers. My aunt's a teacher. I'm married to another family of teachers. So that is strong. I suppose I would say it started with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I was doing my undergrad. And my senior year, I was like, what am I going to do when I get out of here, right? Like, I want to be an artist. I want to be a working artist, right? And my parents were like, yo, you should find like a job or like an internship, like something that pays you money, honey. And I was like, right. They've always encouraged me to go after my dreams, but they were kind of very logical at the same time, pragmatic, so to speak. So I signed up and applied for a museum education internship at the Art Institute. And I got it. And it was like this crash course in teaching. I didn't know it at the time. So I was teaching, I was interning. So I was a museum docent. I was with kids, kindergarten through 12, walking them through, creating like thematic lesson plans, walking them through the exhibit. And that kind of was the bug, when you get bit by the teaching bug and you're like, oh, this is amazing. That like moment that you're like, this is so cool. This energy, the synergy between me and other people, that's when it clicked. But I didn't become a teacher until 9 years ago. Long story short, after grad school, in museum studies, moved to Seattle, independent curator for a little bit, curatorial assistant, moved back to LA where I live now, and then got the teaching job. So elementary school was the first thing. So yeah, I guess that's how I became teaching. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And then I guess the other half of it is your own art practice. And like, do you still kind of have your own art practice, and where does that
I'm
fit
laughing
in?
Because my art practice, I think all art practices do, but they evolve, they ebb, they flow. I always think about it like the tide,
Totally.
Think about the ocean, like, how things wax and wane, like it comes in and it comes out and it comes back to me and then it goes away. And I try and accept it like that's natural, that's organic. So I've been making art since I can remember. There's tons of pictures of me as a little kid with like the easel, the paintbrush. Like I've always been the mix all the colors together kid, never keep them separate, individual. I love mixing. I thought I was going to be a fashion designer, and then I ended up in fiber and material studies, and that just spoke to my heart. I don't know. It makes sense to me. Materials together, telling stories. So I didn't make work a long time after undergrad. And then I'd say probably, I don't know, I make artwork now. That's how I can answer that question. And it ebbs and flows. I was in a dry spell, what I'd call, or like for a while. And then while teaching, like my first couple of years teaching, you're just trying to like learn everything. You're up so late making the lessons, etc. I didn't have a lot to give to myself. And then finally, after a couple of years, I was like, okay, I think, I got a couple lessons. They work all right. And then I started getting back into the making. But the past 3 years, or past 4 years, I guess I'd say, since my son, so 4 years, With a job change, I made more work again. Like the process of, I don't know, gestating and creating life is pretty intense. I'm going to try and watch my words. I have a potty mouth, so I'm going to behave myself. But it was really intense. So that's going to be my pauses. Sydney knows about my potty mouth. And I think that's when I started really making work again. And that moves in between painting and mixed media. And now I'm back to making some new work because I have a daughter now and they're both just fueling some new ideas, and I'm revisiting things. I guess that's the easiest way to answer that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in there because, as you know, I also am a mom, just one, but it's a lot.
It is.
And also just the ebb and the flow. That's reality. That's life. It's so real. Sydney, would you want to jump in and kind of share your background, your like entry into teaching and your sort of art practice?
Yeah, sure. So I'm like, it was a mistake to have Flavia go first because now I'm going to follow that.
Why did you say that? Oh, you're so awesome. This is actually go. It's good. You have such a good story. Go.
Okay. Well, I would say I was actually really resistant when it comes to getting into teaching. I studied art in undergrad and I switched to that major like right at the beginning of my junior year. I think I was studying English and they wouldn't let me do just poetry. Like they said I had to do fiction, like short form, whatever. And I was like, I'm done. So I switched to art and was very happy. And I was feeling the same kind of thing. Like I want to become a working artist after this, and that's what I'm going to pursue. And my mom, as I got closer to graduation, was really pushing me to do this alternative teacher training program that's in Colorado, or in Denver at a school called Stanley British Primary School. And she was just constantly like sending me information. Oh, they have interviews next week. And I'm like, I'm in California. I don't know how I'm getting to the interview. And so finally she was like, maybe I just really want to do this. And so my mom did the teacher training program and I moved back out to Colorado after graduating and I started subbing at schools and I was like a tutor for a while at a tutoring center. And I eventually got a job at that school, Stanley British Primary School. I began teaching art there without any kind of like degree in teaching or training, but every job I'd ever had in my entire life was working with children. So it was like, I knew how to do that. Like I'm very good with kids, but the school after a year said that they'd like pay me to do their training program. So I was like, well, I can't pass that. Like I'm not going to be a teacher, but I can't pass that up. So I did that. That was really hard because most people, they're placed in a school. And so it's like a year-long program and you're doing your training at the same time as you're like working in a classroom, like you're student teaching. But I was also teaching art at the school. So I had to do like the multiple subject student teacher stuff, but then also teach art. So I went down to 1 day a week that I was teaching art, but it was like so much work. And then I got really sick and we didn't know what was going on with me for a long time. And it ended up being like a really hard year because on top of all the work, I was just really sick. So when that year ended, I was like, I'm done teaching. I will never teach again. I'm going to become a server at a restaurant. Like I want a job that I don't have to think about when I go home. And I also had felt like I just didn't fit in at the school where I was. There was like kind of a vibe that no one believed I was sick. And I had like a really serious GI infection called C. diff. And I ended up not being able to work for a while and needing some like serious medical procedures and stuff. So anyway, I moved out to California and I started subbing at a friend's school. She'd been teaching there for like maybe 8 years. And I started subbing and I was like, I'm just doing this to make some money. I need to do something. I'm never going to teach again in my life. And I was teaching summer school there and they came in and they were like, you have a background in art, right? Yeah. Can you start teaching art this year? And they had like just had one of their teachers leave, their art teachers leave. So I was offered a job and I was like, I guess I can take it for like a year, but I'm never teaching again. And I realized that I guess in that job, I realized like, oh, this is what I do. Because I just found a school that's like my perfect fit and a community that's like so supportive, both parents and staff members. I mean, I don't know how it'll look after COVID, but like everyone's walking down the hall, like hugging each other. It was just like my kind of like lovey, supportive place. And so that made the job sustainable for me and happy. So I definitely had a moment where I was like, okay, I'm coming to terms with the fact that like, this is my job. This is like, what I love doing. And then in terms of art making, I had the same kind of experience as Flavia when I first got into teaching. It was like no time or space for my own practice. But before that, I was making really, I think we all were like in undergrad, like conceptual work. And I felt like that's the only work that you're allowed to make. Like it doesn't count if it's not something that needs an artist statement. And so it was actually me getting really sick and making work about that experience that got me back into art making. And I joined a collective that was it was called Patient Experience in Los Angeles. And it was all artists who live with illness and make work about illness. And that community kind of got me back into making work. And that was, about my experience with illness. So that had some concept behind it. And then once I started teaching again, totally fell away. And I also have pretty bad depression. So when that hits, it's like not happening. So I realized, I wasn't doing what I was teaching my students, which is like experiment, sit down, pick something up and see what happens. Cause I'm teaching in a choice-based classroom. So it's like, okay, maybe I should start doing that. And so in the last couple of years, I've kind of gotten back to regular art making and working with yarn and felt and dye and glitter, which is like a long time preferred medium. But yeah, so it was kind of like stepping back and looking at my teaching practice and teaching myself how to get back into making art.
I love that. And I mean, I had also a very long 3 to 4 year break of just not making anything at all when I was pregnant and then a new mom and like just could not handle life in general. But I feel like the beginning of teaching is also just, it's overwhelming. There's so much that you're focused on. Yeah. And then also I love that, like what you said about the statement and conceptual work and how there's this idea out there that like, if it's not conceptual, if there isn't like a big idea behind it, like it's not worthy or something, and just like breaking that down, throwing that out, being like, I can make stuff with glitter that's pretty and it's still art.
I mean, I wish you could see behind me right now because I was making like giant glitter paintings of poop. So I would like, they are pretty. Like when the light hits them, you should see them, but
they're so pretty. They were so pretty. Like talk about getting to know somebody that you've never met in real life. Like I've never met Sydney in real life. Just want to put that out there. Like we became friends over Instagram as people. So like we've never met except like via, Zoom and whatnot. But every time we chatted, I was like, I have a question. Like there's glitter pieces. And then she was like, oh, this is going to be so awkward. And it was like funny because, being a parent, you end up talking about a lot of bodily fluids, quite often. So it was interesting. But Sid, I love what you said about how your students influence you. I always had to catch myself when I say kids because I'm like, there's like my children and then there's like my kids, like my students. That's how I think of them. And I think they influence you so much. Like they were like, why aren't you making? Why aren't you painting? Especially middle school for me, like my 8th and 9th graders are like, you have such cool ideas. You should make stuff. I'm like, no, I shouldn't make stuff. And they're like, why aren't you making stuff? And I'm like, I'm not being true to like what I'm teaching, right? And you got to be authentic. So I just love that part. I feel that a lot.
Yes, totally. And it's so hard to take your own advice sometimes. Oh. Sometimes you need a young person to push you.
It's really true out of the mouth of babes in a sense. Like, they're so wise and we don't, a lot of people just don't listen to kids enough. They're so smart.
They are.
I also feel like curriculum takes a lot of creative energy.
Yeah.
I don't do like a lot of projects. Like, here's what we're doing. We're all doing this, but we do a ton of art history and we do a ton of medium specific lessons, just like general use of stuff. But I put just so much energy into the creation of these lessons that it just like wipes you out creatively, or it can. So I think that's also where you have to also take what those students are giving and use that in your own practice when there's nothing left up there. Because I've definitely gotten to that point on more than one occasion.
Yeah. And then you guys are also, I've been working on getting away from that phrase too. Guys, you guys, you all, you amazing women have also been creating lessons for adding voices and sharing, putting those lessons out into the world, which is another job on top of all the things you're doing. Would you want to talk about that a little bit? And I know it moved from, like, Flavia was the original idea to do it as this conference that's maybe an annual conference. And then how did it like end up where it is right now?
Ooh, how did Adding Voices end up where it was? So it begun with an idea, I don't know, years ago, of feeling like I've had the privilege of going to some amazing conferences that have been steeped in inclusion, diversity, and equity work and social justice. And I always found when I went, I was being fed in some points as like overall the educator, but not specifically in my field, right? And for me, I have I think most of us have some untraditional way of going into teaching. But for me, I thought I was going to work in museums, right? Like my degree, my master's degree is in museum studies. So I was like, I'm going to do curatorial work or museum education. So I came at it, in a circumventing way. So it wasn't like a set textbook. And I felt that by the time I ended up teaching, learning kind of in like on the job learning, so to speak, and I was going to these conferences, first it was like culture responsive teaching that hit me and I got educated. And that hit me, but I never had something that spoke to the specific field. Does that make sense? Like departmentally or like the discipline of teaching art. And so I always thought, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if there was something like that? And then my mother actually joked with me. She's like, so you made your own professional development by pretty much like creating an entire conference. And I was like, I guess I did, Mom. I'm like, wow. So I guess that's how it started. And then I ran the conference, I think it was the 4th of June. So it was my daughter's a month-old birthday. So she was very little. Like it's
a little bit crazy.
Yes. Sydney, you and Sydney can talk perhaps about me later. Sydney puts me
crazy in a good way. Like that's incredible.
Thank you. She's probably one of my biggest cheerleaders to talk about someone you've never met in person. So that's how it started. And then when George Floyd happened, so I already had shared the idea. I already had started creating it. And Sydney and I met because she was one of the first 40 people before the escalation of police brutality came to, I think, public view and George Floyd's murder. Sydney was already like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I've been waiting for a conference like this all my life. This is totally my jam. And this is all like via like Instagram, right? And I was like, oh, who's this lady? Like, so, like, hi, I'm Sydney. I really want to present. Da, da, da. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. She's like, can we run some ideas? Like, can we hop on a call? Can we chat? I'm all about inclusive teaching. I was like, oh my gosh, yes. Yeah, me too. Like, let's talk about inclusive teaching. And then that led us to learning we had totally different concepts of and ideas of what we meant by inclusive teaching.
And I'm curious there, like, what would you say were your different ideas there?
You want to go? Yeah.
Yeah. So the school that I'm at it's called CHIME, and that stands for Community Honoring Inclusive Model Education. So we are a fully inclusive school, which means that all of our students learn side by side all day. Students with developmental disabilities are in the same classroom all day. Like there's no pullouts for any kind of like speech therapy or anything. It all happens in the classroom. We have a lot of paraprofessionals who are amazing and so hardworking and make that possible. We also have every gen ed teacher has a SPED co-teacher. So there's a ton of collaboration. It takes a lot of work to run a school like that. But once you're in it, it's like, why isn't every school like this? So that's what inclusion meant to me. Like, I was like, oh, I'm all about it. And then, Flavia, she mentioned this culturally responsive teaching, like conference, and really getting into that and that being a huge passion in that. Flavia, would you say that's like your angle that you were coming at?
Mine was coming, from, I think, culture responsive teaching and thinking about, an anti-racist classroom space and thinking about how do we cultivate student voice. So when I was thinking of inclusion, I was thinking from different aspects of equity, but I wasn't thinking about abilities the same way, right? So then we were like, tell me more. Like, it was like, I can't say instant friendship, but is that okay to say? I feel like, instant friendship.
Yeah.
So then that birthed, the conference happened. We're chatting this entire time through the conference. Like, we've now exchanged text messages at this point, and we're chatting up.
all day,
like all day, and then checking in, be like, am I overdoing boundaries? Is this all right? Like, do you feel comfortable? Right. Cause I'm trying to respect the fact I've never met this person, but like, there's just this energy, this creative energy. Right. And it's summer, that's when we're all in that great marination station, as I call it to my students, like we're marinating on great ideas and like, we're fresh again because, you get worn out. So then I said, I really, I feel like they should go further. All these people want to know what's next for this conference. So maybe I should do like a newsletter. And people were like, do you have lessons? And I was like, maybe I should make some lessons. And this is like, so I'm bouncing ideas off of Sydney. And then eventually she's like, you should totally do it. And then I was like, do you want to do it with me? Because I'm scared. And so you got to grab a buddy. And so we kind of just, ran off into the sun. It's not sunset. Sorry. We have a completely platonic relationship of, but I mean,
it really was like, I'm going, yeah, you should do that. Yeah, you should. Yep. Take it. Yep. Do it. And then it was like, getting more specific about ideas and what do you think about like a lesson like this and how would a lesson like that? And the more we talked about it, it was like, should we just be doing this together? Like it just it happened really organically. I think our friendship did and our work relationship did. And we realized pretty quickly that just like, we worked really well together. Like I was someone who in all of my schooling was like, I can't do a group project. I have to work by myself. And it was like, we just jammed. Like we could talk all day, like nerd out on art history and like the art history that we're into specifically. But yeah.
So I guess that's how it started to answer. I think that answered.
Yeah.
I think we answered the question.
Yes. It's so interesting to hear. And I mean, I would love to also share, because I love what you're doing, but I feel like listeners need to know more about what you're doing. Maybe sharing what are the topics of some of the lessons? What are like, do you have a favorite lesson that you've put out there? Yeah. Anything, I guess, more about that content.
Ooh, I feel like Sydney's about to do some researching and pulling up things on the computer.
I can tell you guys are pulling it up.
Notes are okay. This is not a test.
Totally okay.
Collaborative conversation. I would say, well, first off, Adding Voices is a community. So we haven't figured out if we are some form of organization. I don't know if we're a club, but that's to be sought out or to continue to meditate on. Mm-hmm. But we're an online conference and we're building a community for art educators of color and co-conspirators that we'd like to call allies. So overall, what that conference is a call to action to art education, to really start talking about inclusive pedagogy, to really start talking about anti-racist curriculum, culturally responsive teaching from K through 12 and the college level. So really addressing solutions for equity and courageous conversations. And then that birthed our Patreon, which has a newsletter. And then it also, if you are on a higher tier, or I don't know what to call that. It's so weird because it's hierarchical in its nature. Anyway, I digress. Sorry. And then if you're on another tier, you can be receiving art lessons. So those art lessons right now are more artist focused. So they're highlighting a specific artist because we felt so many people were asking us like, what's a great Black artist? What about a Black woman artist? What about a female? What about a trans artist? Like all these questions of who, right? Mm-hmm. And also trying not to fall into the tropes of tokenism, right? Like just because you pick a person of color, right, as your artist doesn't mean you're delving into questions or necessarily know how to use that artist to then, what's the word I want to use?
Like have conversations. You always call them courageous conversations.
Yeah, I'm like such a visual person. I'm like, it's like this, like that it feeds or cycles into, I think it provides opportunities to then delve into deeper conversations, right, about equity, social justice, race, and to have those courageous conversations in your classroom. So that's what they are. And they vary between different artists. Sid, you want to keep adding to that because you have it pulled?
Well, we both always really loved doing the newsletter because Flavia and I were both really into like magazines when we were younger. And like I also wanted to be a fashion designer and just like,
so fun.
So that the aesthetic side of it, I think is really fun for us, but also just like doing little tidbits. So we get deep into a lesson, in the lesson plan, but we also like to give like a lot of resources, like a ton of resources in the newsletters. And we both really enjoy finding those and sharing those. And that was really the big thing, is that both of us were doing this in our own classrooms and just kind of in a vacuum in our own school. And it was like just putting so much work into creating these lessons. And it was like, I would love to share these. I want to see your lessons. I want to see. So that's really where like the community part comes in. And we're really hoping in the new year to find ways to add voices, whether that's helping out with the conference or we're trying to feature teaching artists like in our newsletter. And I don't know.
No, I love that.
Yeah, totally. And then it adds like, so every lesson that comes through. So right now we are artist based. We have talks about moving more so to like thematic based or inquiry based lessons, just as a means to be more thematic and to help in a sense, bring on contemporary pedagogy, right? When we're really thinking about how to build curriculum. But we thought it was a great place to start, like familiarity. That's when Sydney and I first started talking, like, a lot of teachers, when they first start, I know for me, it was like Deep Space Sparkle and other places. And that was the first place I went. I was like, oh, you type in art lessons and these things come up. And then you look at them, right? And you kind of seen that format. And we were like, well, what would ours look like, right? Like dreaming that dream. And it's changed a little bit since from the first one to where we're at now, right? That's the cool thing about evolution and growth. But I think we always have a picture of the artist. We always have like a brief little overview. And then we break it up to suggested materials, always talking about the fact that the teacher has to do internal work, right? Before they're working externally with their students, that there's always individual work we must do before we can teach, right? Like you got to know your content before they do and feel comfortable asking those questions to yourself as the adult.
And materials, you mean like resources for teachers, like articles and like we include not like art materials.
Yes. Yeah. So then that's like, we have vocabulary that should be used. Then we do the core standards. We of course have studio habits of mind. That's Sydney's jam. And then, I don't know, we ebb and flow, but there's always some pictures of the artist. And then the biggest thing is the materials. So the materials are everything from, yes, we talk about what materials you should use, but they're suggestions, right? All of us know our students the best. And then we introduce the art and the artist. And then we talk about, my favorite part personally is talking about the culturally responsive teaching part, because I'm a nerd. I love doing the discussion questions and how to delve deeper and the teacher preparation. There's a whole section that we call teacher preparation that I guess I have the honor of writing. And that's kind of really delving deep into each artist and like how we can make the artist relevant to the world today, right?
And I get really into we have a section on accessibility and making this lesson accessible to all students in terms of both like the physical materials they're using, but also like just the artists themselves and the questions we're asking in the paper material, the whole lesson. And then I also, like I said, I teach in a choice-based classroom. So we try and also have the lesson be kind of open-ended. And like Flavia said, like everyone knows their students best. And I also know like this third grade class is very different from this third grade class is very different from this one. And this one's really into fashion design right now. And this one's really into drawing cars. And this one's really into building at the architecture center. So, you need room and flexibility in these lessons to be able to reach all your students. So
yeah, I love that. It sounds so useful, so helpful for teachers. I feel like just my teaching situation is so not the norm. And I'm curious what I guess you're both teaching, you've been teaching virtually, right? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about your like personal teaching situations, but then also do your lessons, it sounds like they're flexible enough that they would kind of like teachers would be able to adjust for whatever situation they're in with the pandemic right now.
Well, with the pandemic, we decided to add that aspect to the lesson. So there's always a digital component that we've added inside the lessons at that level.
Yeah.
So that there's some options for teachers, because we know like across the states, right? Like everyone's in a different teaching situation depending on where they are. For me, I'm 100% online. So I have only been on campus to be alone in my own room. And even that's limited because I have children at home who need me. So yeah, it depends. Like I planned a lesson thinking that we were going to be back in real space and time because we had a visiting artist come, and I was so pumped. I was like, it's going to be like this. And this is totally, and I got it all planned. And I was just so geeked out with my multiple little, how you do it, like your Post-its and you're like doodle all over it. And you're like, we're going to do it. It's going to be so great. They're going to be so excited. And you got your plan. And then that goes away. And then you have to hit the drawing board. So it totally changed for me. I was doing a piece on Patrick Martinez. He's an incredible artist from Los Angeles. And so we're lucky enough to have a visiting artist program at my school. So he came to visit. We had a plan. He does these amazing memorial cake projects, or paintings, excuse me. We made a project out of it, but he does these cakes amplifying people who he feels like haven't been celebrated, right? And that deserve that space. So he puts them on these paintings that look like sheet cakes. And then he also has this amazing neon work. So I was going to do neon with my students, and that went out the window because I didn't have time for that. Like neon wire, but that was just like, we can't do that. But it was going to be so rad, Sid. Anyway, sorry, I digress. I'm moving past. You have to keep pushing past those moments. We're learning to accept what we cannot control.
Yeah. And that's one, like, you also kind of have that in the back of your head that you can do at some point in the future.
Exactly. We're like, another year, it'll be fine, But I guess so for me, it totally changed. Materials completely changed. Like I packed everything for my students, sent them. So for me, it's important to put in context that, so I teach 7th, 8th, and 9th grade at an independent school. And I teach 7th grade, which is a foundations course. So they learn every form of materials. Does that make sense? All disciplines. Mm-hmm. And then I'm also very discipline based, as in I'm a drawing and painting teacher for 8th and 9th grade. Mm-hmm. So it's a very specific focus of what I teach, which is very different, but it's also fun because I love drawing and painting. It's a big passion of mine. So I kind of get a little bit of both, but that changed from a painting project to a mixed media project, but it turned out great. So I'm really pleased with the results. And I think that's the beauty of this process is, we keep telling kids to be flexible or, it's going to be okay. Right. And to accept what happens. And I think accept what happens, but it's beautiful to see the growth, the learning moments, I think as a teacher, right? Because as art teachers, we're like, we can find a way, like give me this glue gun, some duct tape and a Sharpie and I'm going to make this thing happen, right? Like that's our nature. And sometimes you just got to be like, back it up. Like that's not going to happen this time. Like you just got to accept like, nope. Like, we're that way.
Yeah. It was also really cool as an educator to get to watch Flavia go through that process and the evolution of the lesson, because she was sending me stuff and I was just going like, yep, sounds good. I mean, like rarely would I be like, maybe try this. But so I was seeing just like the changes that she made, and she'd say, hey, I did this lesson today and this happened and I wasn't expecting this. And I know like I'm doing the same thing, especially as we're all adjusting to Zoom, but to watch her do it was really cool. Like to see her say like, I tried this really didn't work. What do you think about trying this? Okay, I tried that. That didn't work. They're all at home. I couldn't walk up and show them like, no, this is it. So just seeing that behind the scenes problem solving and like the evolution of the lesson was really cool. And that's what I think is really big right now and I think this is a really great opportunity to make mistakes. Like that's a big thing in my classroom is talking about making mistakes and that being a huge part of learning, and that learning is not happening if you're not making mistakes. And so I've become pretty comfortable with that and talking about that with my students. But that is like, I guess, a positive side of this experience is that we're able to kind of look at our own practice and really get into like, how is this working? Because I'm also entirely online. So it's given us at my school an opportunity to try some different things that we haven't felt like we had time for in person, because since we do choice-based, we struggled with like what to send home with students. So we ended up doing a supply list. And it was kind of like, if you don't have any of these things, you can't get them, let us know. We'll get it sent to you. But in the classroom, like I'll have 6 kids on the rug building with blocks, and I'll have 3 kids at the collage center making some like collaborative, not anymore, like collaborative kind of 3D collage craziness. And then over at the drawing center, I probably have like 6 or 10 kids. And then over at the painting center, I have 5 kids. So how do you do that at home? So we switched our format, and it's really given us an opportunity to like expose our youngest students to a lot of artists that we just don't have time for in school, because in school, it's like, how do you access an art studio? Like, how do you take care of materials? How do you use all these materials? Because in order to use them, children. We first do like a little lesson on them. So the first half of the year is always like just getting to know materials and learning to work in an art studio, because we started tab choice-based 3 years ago. So the whole school has been transitioning to that. So now they're using whatever materials they have at home. And I'm still seeing the 6 kids with the Legos. And now I have some students with Play-Doh, and I have some students who are drawing, and we sent home sketchbooks for everyone, but we're doing open-ended challenges. And there was also the accessibility component. So our students at school are working with, like I mentioned, the paraprofessionals who are trained to support those students. And now all of a sudden they're home with parents who, of course, know how to take care of their children, but supporting someone academically is really different. And in an art class, it's like, I've had parents say like, how is my child going to paint? And so, and in class, I'm like, here's this grip and here's this slant board and here. So we wanted to make sure the challenges were really open-ended in that sense also. So it wasn't like you're making a drawing of a favorite person this week. It was like, make art about someone you admire. So it's open-ended. And then we show like usually like 2 to 4 examples of artists who make work about people that they admire. And we've had so much fun putting those challenges together, and the students have had so much fun. And it's a choice, like they can do the challenge or not do the challenge. So we've kind of kept the tab spirit alive, but it's also, I think in school, you have to kind of get used to someone not telling you what to do, like just sitting down and making your own work. And during a pandemic, as an adult, it's like, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to get motivated. So the challenges have also been helpful for that. We're doing different stuff in middle school, but that's kind of how we've been doing lower school.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good way to approach tab. I had been sort of shifting to tab before the pandemic, and I could not handle continuing some version of tab with basically being told I say the same thing. My kids have no materials, do, super basics. And we didn't have art kits out until right just now. So all fall, it was like, recycling and a pencil, and with pre-recorded videos. So not even like seeing them in real time at all, and not even getting no feedback, just totally like strange way of teaching where, it's impossible to adjust on the fly. I know that came up, like you were talking about seeing Flavia adjust on the fly in this like Zoom land. But also, I mean, that's something that we naturally do in the classroom all the time, and not being able to do that and not knowing, like, I'm sure parts of what I say are like not making sense or just not working, but I don't know which parts. So that's been a huge challenge for me as well. I feel like it's just helpful to hear what other art teachers are dealing with right now and how you've been handling all the challenges that have been thrown at you. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Every day's a new day. I think we've kept each other afloat. Or I'm going to speak from just the eye perspective. I need to practice and say to that. But like for me, hearing Sydney tell me like she's having a rough time has really helped, because when you're in your own bubble, right? Like your own experience is just, like I only know my lived experience. And like right now it's really hard. My husband's also a teacher, so we're both Zoom teaching, but he's a college professor. So we're passing a baby back and forth between us while we teach, and then hoping she's napping. Oh. So that's just like a component in my brain. And I've sent Sydney pictures when she's like, how are you doing? And it's like, I have the baby strapped to me and I'm like teaching or like trying to input stuff. But what I appreciated what Sid said was that it's like the questions you ask students. I always come back to this. It's part of culture responsive teaching, of thinking about how we ask a question is so important for our students, or how we pose something, or the directive, right? And I always think about that's really affected me, I think, with this pandemic and teaching, is the difference of just saying like, make art about blank versus I need you to do a drawing, right? Especially for my 7th graders, my foundation courses, I'm like, create something meaningful, thinking about, right? And I like have these long pauses, and I'm a mixture. I'm like, I'm synchronous and asynchronous. So I understand what you mean when I'm like, here's the tutorial. Like, this is how you gesso something, apply something to another surface, right? Mm-hmm. And then they come back and I'm like, okay, it's like surprise. there's a surprise element. And then it really makes me think about just forms of communication and those who are neurally divergent. It's just, I feel like I'm growing so much. It's painful, right? Growth is painful. It is not, like metamorphosis. I do not think is this, that's what I'm going through, but it is hard when you can't just play to your strengths, right? Like personally, like I'm quite good at drawing. It's a good, like I feel very confident saying that. And so I'm like, oh, I can help you draw a face. Like I could go right next to you, show you how to draw the nose and then compare, contrast, watch you do it. The littlest thing of like how you're holding the pencil or turn the paper, move it sideways, hold it like this. And to not have, like not getting through this screen makes it really frustrating. And so I'm sitting there on the fly and my head is like the problem solving is what's exhausting beyond breaking through the fourth wall that is like a screen. I find that's what is most tiring probably by the end of the day is even though if I have the lesson and then I have to change it in real time, it's the amount of problem solving and also appearing like calm, but being like, okay, guys, this isn't working. See, I did it again. Everybody, this isn't working. Okay, let's just take that. Does anyone have any ideas? Write me in the chat. Like it starts being collaborative. And I keep coming back to that. Like we are in community together. They are equally artists as much as I am. And I need to pause and allow them to lead me as well, right? It's like that give and take.
Oh, that's so powerful. They're artists as much as you are and having that like collaboration.
And I've seen Flavia do this with teaching too. And I do this with my students, like soliciting feedback about like our actual teaching. So, and I don't do it as much with lower school. I see them 30 minutes a week, which is really fast on Zoom when you're showing materials. But my older students, I've found much harder to engage. Half of them will have their cameras off and then you can't tell if they're like playing a video game at the same time, and they're amazing. And I can't imagine as a teenager being home with my parents 24 hours a day. Like just that alone is like, where do you escape to? So like, I get it. There's no criticism there whatsoever, but it's been hard to figure out how to engage all of my students all the time. And you're really, it's like performance art, but that feedback has been really important. So getting feedback, just like, how do you think that lesson went? What would you change about this semester? But also saying like, what was your favorite memory? And then students are thinking like, and that's really helpful information too. Cause it's like, oh, I guess we should bring in more guest artists because 19 out of 20 students said that was their favorite class of the whole semester. And I know Flavia does those feedback surveys too. And I didn't do that my first few years teaching, and it's really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great tip for teachers to just ask for feedback like that. Yeah.
And now you can just do like a Google form.
Right.
And then click, click, click.
Like, yeah, we can like space to it and do like the breakout room. But yeah, there's like so many options you can do. But I think it's so important to ask them because what you think is the best lesson, right? Like it comes back to that, like what you think your best lesson is and often what they think the best lesson is are very two different things, right? And then for me, I think it always provides, it's beyond perspective. I think, again, it just comes to like learning what's being received and to get away from product-based concepts sometimes. Like for me right now, especially with Zoom, like yes, it'd be great and lovely if you produce something as a student in my class. That is the goal. But to me, if I was just successful, especially because I teach about 12 to 15, right? Like that's the age group I'm talking to on a daily basis. And there's lots of feels there. You are with your family all the time. There's a lot going on there. Like that's the hunger for independence, right? That's like where you know who you are. And school having the other place that where you can just exist, right, is everything for all kids, but especially, that age grouping. And so sometimes there's like, can you just draw me how you feel or give me one word, right? And it's dead silent most of the time. Oh, it's so silent. And, I just lean into it. Like I sit there and I count, I just wait for them to reply with anything. And it starts with one person and then another. And then like, I'm crying by the end because they're just like, I'm not okay, or they're like, I'm fine. And then someone else is like, I'm totally stressed out. And then slowly they're starting to build community, right? But I'm so curious what these artists are going to be like. When you think about our students, these artists, the way in which we're asking them to think about materials and be resourceful, like, I'm so excited, right? Like think about the art they're going to make or how they're going to think about materiality in this whole other format, the problem solving, the critical thinking skills. Sorry, it just makes me excited.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. It's totally pushed me as a teacher to be like, okay, what I have like a plethora of art materials in front of me right now, but okay, if I like erase my little like studio at home and just go to my kitchen, like what, and don't use food items because they might need to eat them. But like, what else do I have? What can I do with these basic household things? Yeah, that's been a huge challenge. And I love that framing of it too. Like, think about the possibilities, how exciting this is for the future. Thank you.
And I feel like we're kind of coming back to that concept thing, because we're also like I said, there's a huge materials focus in my class for the first half of the year. And now it's like entirely conceptual. And the other art teacher and I at my school and I like don't have setups at home really where we can like demonstrate drawing something. So it's really like art history and sharing art. And that's a big thing that we've started doing that I think we're going to have to incorporate pretty heavily when we get back on campus, is sharing art, because we've seen at this point, like I kind of track who shares and they're all sharing now, and just seeing like that you can really see who they are and where they're at right now. And it's really different sometimes one week to the next, like what they're making work about. And that's like with kindergartners, like you're seeing that conceptual work from the littlest ones, because we all need an outlet to process what's going on in the world. Like I never had anything happen like this when I was a kid. So that is a cool side of it. I think it's really different.
Yeah, I see that I have my daughters in kindergarten doing like online kindergarten. And she's like arted out at this point, because I was making her help me with demos and stuff. So at this point, she's like, my teacher said that art project's optional. I don't want to do it. She's just like, no more art, Mom. I'm done. But I see it coming out in other ways for her.
That's important.
And yeah. But I would love to hear more about your sort of artwork and what's happening with that now for both of you.
Sid, you want to go?
Like our own or student work or our own work?
Yeah, your own work, because I feel like we've talked a lot about teaching. And I know you're both, like you talked about kind of that like ebb and flow and how challenging it is in terms of time. But then I feel like that's also another interesting thing to hear about and like helpful thing to hear from other teachers who are wanting to make art. You know, are you still during all of this, and how are you fitting it in? And what does that look like? Is it doing some of the same things you see it doing for students, where it's like helping you kind of like process things and get them out? Yeah. It's like 20 questions in one.
I think for me, and I told Flavia this earlier, like I said that at the beginning of this, like I feel like uncomfortable talking about my work when it's not conceptual, and I don't have that statement because for me it's become really like I know all art making a lot of art making is like a tactile thing, but like I've been doing a lot of sewing. I make lots of pom-poms and tassels and do a lot of stuff with yarn, and just like that repetitive cutting and like stabbing something with a needle. I did try punch needle this year, and I've just felt like, because I can't get out and interact with people and walk around, and that's so much of our job, that like I need to do something with my body at some point during the day. And I'm trying to do some yoga. That's the extent of my physical activity right now. But I just have this feeling in my body that I need to do something. And so I'm doing a lot more like craft kind of work. And the way I kind of got back into art making at the beginning of the pandemic was I was experimenting with, like, I had been making a lot of little sewn felt things. And I made this thing I really liked that was like kind of this moon shape. And it had like, I was able to incorporate some of the drawer of pom-poms that I've made, and tassels and beads and stuff. And I liked it. And so I kind of just took that as a template. Literally, like I had a template that I used, but then I also was like, I can do this. So I'm going to make color choices and texture choices, and I can think creatively, but without going beyond what I feel like I'm capable of doing right now. So it was just kind of like, I call it easy art, and it's like easy listening. Like that's what's worked for me. And that's been accessible to me during this pandemic.
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like taking the pressure off in that way is great. Like I don't feel like there should be any apologies for it or, and using craft materials that's back. Like that's totally like so many people are doing that in the art world and just elevating those materials, but not to say that it has to be something that's meant for galleries. Like I feel like what you're doing is beautiful and valuable and valid.
Thank you.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting because you make me think about, I think there's always this boundary or this invisible barrier between craft and technique, right? What we consider those things. And I feel like that's completely rooted within the patriarchy, right? And the way in which we are considered to view materials, right? And materiality, right? Like when you read books like Subversive Stitch or, Thinking Through Craft, there's a whole bunch of them where like the theory and talking about conceptual, like the need to make or to use soft materials, right, is so coded, right? Such coded language of like what we choose to consider high art versus low art, right? And I think there's something therapeutic about materiality itself, just whatever the material is. And working with it. I actually think you're super conceptual, Sid. I just don't think you're like aware of what you're currently like processing. It's just, it's like the outside, right? Like you could totally feel how you feel, right? I always tell my students there's that difference between like your own individual perception of your art making, right? And others and how they perceive it. And that both are equally valid. And you have to step back as an artist. And that took me a long time to learn, but I try to teach that now inside the critique process. But I think making things with your hands is so important. I'm very similar. So I felt the need to make, but it took me a while. I felt the first thing I made was the conference. That sounds strange and conceptual, but it felt like a second birthing, so to speak, with that ebb and flow. Like my daughter is definitely like this masterpiece that I marvel at. Same with my son now at 4. It's a masterpiece that has a lot of opinions that I don't always like, or a lot of, I don't want to go to bed and another story, right? But at the end of the day, there are works of art that are living and breathing that I can't control. And I think once I learned that in parenting, it was really beautiful because you're stepping back and watching evolution, like this tiny human evolve, right? Or people become who they are, right? Just like our students. And what you can do is just slowly shape from side to side. And it feels like sculpture a little bit or dance. And I'm a dancer. I haven't danced in a really long time. That's probably where, like, if we talk about, I always think about like births and deaths in life and thinking you'll get used to it. It's okay, Rebecca. I'm just kind of like this with my ebbs and my flows.
I love it. I love it.
So for me, like the death is dance right now, right? Like dance is not, it's in the winter right now. Like, I miss it a lot, but I'm just not in a place where I can do that. I feel out of my body that way. I'm very much so like a modern contemporary dancer. So for me, like Martha Graham, the idea of the contraction, right? And then we release it, the soul jumping out. Like that's my jams for movement. And so I'm just not there, probably because my body's in service to like a human. And I don't know, I'm just not there in pandemic. But in terms of art making, similarly, I've felt the need to make, and I feel like there's these processes of making, right? Like there's what happens in your brain, right? The thinking, the dreaming of art or thinking about what it could look like. I don't know what you have. Like I can see things, it's like glimmers of what something looks like. And then all of a sudden I'm like, right? But I rarely have time to do any of that. So I find that there's almost a part of my art making that now deals with time, like literally like the aspect of time and duration of time. It's not like anywhere intentionally in it. Does that make sense? But it's just my own personal awareness in the making. And then little bits, it's changing expectations, particularly, beyond just like pandemic, parent of now 2 children. It's a difference of perspective. I think that it's in little bits, right? Like for me, 10 minutes has become something very different to me, right? In a teacher world, right? Like that break where you're like, set up, get all the materials, like, hey, go, like, like you're just running around. And now thinking about that time where I'm like, I have 10 minutes, I should eat something, right? Like I need to eat a snack because I have to teach again. But then at that same time, having that moment to steal away and that calm. And I think for me, that's what's provided a therapeutic nature. Also just because the state of the world, I think for me, identify being, Black and Latinx, particularly Mexican. So for me, the world right now is painful. So I feel the need to process all of it, but particularly like aspects of my identity, healing certain parts of that. So right now I'm working with I'm revisiting ideas of identity work and talking about being multiracial, product of an interracial marriage and things like that. But identity work, which I was told to veer away from in undergrad. It was like, this doesn't make sense. This, like, what are you talking about? Or somebody being like, in my day, like, we weren't allowed to comment on Black people's work. And it was a white professor talking to me. They're like, we weren't allowed to comment. And I was like, cool, but like, I'm your teacher. Like, I get that. Cool. That was like the 70s or whatever, but like, I'm your student now in your class. Hello. Please talk to me about my work. Right. But I was talking a lot about code switching.
Yeah. And that's never cool.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, I was just saying this kind of statement as like, I can't talk about it because I'm white. Right. And it's like, no, you can still talk to me like about the work in any format or like even what it makes you think. Right. So that was very difficult, but I still hadn't had the discipline of, I don't know what the word is, like the finishing of the piece, right? Like the discipline where you have to do those last finishing touches. I wasn't there yet, and that's fine. But I'm revisiting those ideas. So right now, ideas of like a vessel and wrapping are really important to me right now. So I'm working with, I have a very small space to work, which is my table. So I'm working with corn husks.
Ooh, yes.
And it's memory, it's vessel, it's bundles, right? And bundling, in terms of recently having another child, thinking about precious memories are wrapped in like tamales and things like that, right? Like the sweetness or the savory. So I'm really exploring those ideas with the medium and play. I think the only reason why I'm not freaked out, when Sid talks about like, it's not heavily conceptual. So, like, I don't know about my work. And to me, I'm just like, I don't know about my work. It's probably too conceptual, right? Like I'm totally in my brain and my head most of the time. I don't talk about my art making to most people or anybody really.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for asking. I feel like it's somewhere locked in my head, and it's often like there's not bandwidth, right, or space to talk. I'm pretending to be like Valkyrie or like the Hulk playing, Avenger games most, part of my day, or working on, phenomes like ba 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 ba, like with kiddos. So it's in those quiet moments where I'm thinking about precious things that have been there in this aspect of memory that's happening. So in layering. So like and play, that's what I wanted to get to. It's play. And my students reminded me about play. I forgot about play. So silly, right? The adults in me forgot about play. And I'm always telling them, don't rush to be an adult. It's not that great. So what, I can buy boot. Really not excited. Like, the voting thing, that's pretty cool. The driving thing, meh. But like, like everyone, it's not that great, right? Like in the idea of don't be so ready to take on all these responsibilities when you're in this beautiful place to steep and cultivate self. And I realized how much I hunger for that, right? The planting, the harvesting of self, and that's forever. But I feel like there's something within working with these materials right now. I'm showing them to you.
Yeah.
But working with these materials of corn husks on top, like in parts of houses, so to speak, and then on top of the husk, this is like kind of what I'm playing with right now.
Yeah.
And connecting to the work that's behind me, like that piece over here has corn husks on it within braids. I used to do a lot of hair work, and then this piece over here, it's hard to see, but I guess that's where my making is. So it's in small little bits. I always hunger for more time. When I was in, I don't know about you guys, but my youthful self was like, yeah, I'm going to make artwork. And I'd like lock myself in my room, as perhaps not to make people who are actually manic, not to downplay that, but it felt like that, right? Like this like spurt of incredible, intense energy. And so I'd stay up for like 3 nights, like making and just in it and like, thinking about it. And that doesn't exist now, right? Like it's doing that for a few minutes, snack, zooming, or choosing to be very sleep deprived the next day to steal the little moments, right? But there's something to that, I guess is what I mean. Like the process of making it, I don't get to steep in it long enough, right? Like cooking time, where you think about things like that, right? Like for the recipe or what I perceive it to be. So then it's like evolving into this, like, I don't know, like, but I literally set this down because I was working on it while Zooming with you. And now I'm like, oh yeah, like I like it from this perspective. Right? From like the top down, like I'm really, and the way it like loops from the top. So I don't know. But material, it was a material I was afraid to explore. And I think like the play, right? I'm just like, well, let's see what happens. If nobody sees anything, like what? Oh no, I made an Instagram post about it. Like just kind of getting over myself a little bit. The taking yourself a little too seriously sometimes.
So much goodness in there. I feel like I relate to so much of what you're saying, especially the time and that shift into parenthood. And I feel like I've spoken to several parents who all go through, like, we are not alone. They all go through this, like, okay, I have to completely change what I was doing. I have to like how do I fit, what used to be like an entire day on Saturday, just like making my art in my studio, doing my thing, thinking about it like whenever I'm not teaching. And now I have these little people that I loved the way you put it too, that like your body is in service. And, that consumes your mind in a lot of ways too. Like it's hard to have, even when you're sitting there like nursing an infant and you could be thinking about these concepts, it's hard, at least for me, I'm just speaking maybe for myself, but it's hard to like have the mental capacity, the mental space to really think through what it is you're doing with your artwork.
Yeah.
And then the physical time is just like gone.
Yeah, it's the physical and the mental, I think. And it also goes for teaching, I find, because, there's only, one of my brother is a writer and so is my husband. And when we talk about making art, it's like, there's only so much in the pot. There's only so much in like whatever you want to call it, the gumbo, et cetera, right? And all are welcome to the feast, but there's only so much. You got to keep enough so that everyone's fed. And that means you too, right? And so it's this ebb and flow between like the sleep, right? Or feeding myself through the making. But then there's the time with me, right? The conversation I have with my art, right? Like the conversation you're having with yourself when making, like that's just as important, just as much as like my students deserve me fully present. And if I'm too tired, I can't fully be there. I don't know. And sometimes, they get bummed when I'm not making stuff, which is a weird, I don't know, Sydney, if you ever experienced this, we're like, what did you make? Like, what are you drawing? And you're like, well, I made this thing for like the demo. And they're like, wait, like what? Like that is invalid, right? Like for them, they're like, that's not you really.
I had a period where I felt like my work was not like kid friendly. And it wasn't like, I didn't feel like I could share my work with my students. So I was like, yeah, I'm making stuff. And like parents would ask too. And like every once in a while I'd be like, they can do my work. And I'd like give them my website. But now that I'm experimenting and playing and working with like, I'm calling it craft material, but it's like that also has been really accessible to my students because they're really into aesthetics. And so it's just looking at pretty things. They're connecting with that. So that's been fun to be able to feel like I can share more of my work. That like I was doing like a lot of performance art and video art, and the glitter work I said was poop, and so it just
everybody put a book about it. Sid,
and I have another Instagram. I don't even know if Flavia knows about it, called Poo Jazzle, and that's like now an archive of a piece that was related to my experience with illness. So I'm all about poop, and I've brought poop to my school, and I've had conversations with the director of my school when students have included drawings of poop, the poop emoji in their work. And is that appropriate? And I've had those conversations, but it's like, I'm introducing materials at the drawing center. Like, I don't know that I'm going to share my work about like the Kardashians, like my sound art about reality TV.
Right. Well, no, I think that's interesting too. I found it affected my work so much. Like I hadn't drawn and painted in so long. And then like I got this new job where I was so excited, like, drawing and painted, like, yes. And so I went down this, like I have a whole bunch of portraits because I need to teach portraiture. So, right. Like, so I delved into, I have like a whole set of portraits, and my students are like, these are so great. And I'm like, between you and me, like I would never show them. Like I love them. Like, or like I've shown them like they're on my Instagram, but you know what I mean? Like they're not something that I would seek to be
like exhibited.
Yeah, or an exhibit, because there's something about the exhibition that's personal, right? And we talk about that. I think we get to uncover that a lot when we think about our students sharing artwork, right? Like it's deeply personal. And it's a choice to me. It's a boundary piece of like, am I choosing to be open to others telling me their opinion, right? In a sense, weighing its validity, or did I make it for me? And every time I start thinking about it going up on a wall, any kind of art I make, it's not good. I don't like it. Like I don't have enough words for it. I'm like, it just doesn't work. And every time I think like I'm just playing, or I don't put that pressure on myself, it becomes this beautiful moment of learning or something I haven't thought of. But I feel like being in community with our students, remembering you're a student inside that space too, is so clear, because like I wouldn't have going back to this material without that. Like we had the visiting artist come and talk to my students, and he was talking about materials. He does these like urban landscapes, Patrick Martinez, and he was talking about how he uses like a power washer on like, the canvas after he's put house paint on top of it. So he kept talking about the material itself and what he's referencing. And I think for me, I didn't like plan like, oh yeah, this is totally for me, right? Like as a teacher, but just while I was sitting in that space and he was speaking to my students, it all of a sudden was this aha moment. And I was like, I think I gotta go back to the old work. I think I gotta start going back to these courthouses. Like there's more here. And I think calling out the decentering whiteness, right? And really talking about white supremacy is being aware of when acts are done upon you, right? Like I think there's an aspect of telling me the identity work wasn't like worth pursuing. And I was talking to one of my good friends about it. And they were like, you totally should make work about what you're thinking about. Like the old work that you showed me, Flavia, is like, whoa, like do that. Like I'm so sorry you stopped. Right. So there's a healing in that too, if that makes sense. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't know.
And it sounds, to me, it sounds like that professor was uncomfortable and like wanted to make himself comfortable at your expense.
Right. As a teacher now, I'm just like, okay, dude, let's start square one.
No.
Like, yeah, exactly. And it would have been even great if it was just even talking to me about the materials, right? Like just base level, like the materials or the technique. Like you could have picked anything to talk to me about.
I also think when our students and when people are making work about identity, though, like you listen. So there's also when my students share work about themselves, I'm not critiquing them. I am looking at the materials, or I'm asking questions, like, and you're pushing them, but it's not like I don't know, and making connections and relating and sharing other artists that maybe they would connect with, and
or even just being like, I feel like that's so valuable. But if you're at the point where you have like no way to connect to this and you're just super uncomfortable, just say that. Like, I'm sorry that I don't know how to connect to the work you're making. It makes me uncomfortable. Like, can you tell me about it? Leave it at that if that's all you can handle.
Yeah.
Like, really.
No, totally agree. Thank you for that. No, I think it comes back to being like, you were uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable talking about his whiteness in relationship to, right, like my identity. And that's why this work is so important, is to stop acting like saying you're Black or saying someone has brown skin or that you're white is this bad word, right? It's so much more complex than that. And that's where like the internal work versus the external work, right? Like you got to know you and be comfortable sitting in those questions of why is it that you don't know more if it happens to be from a certain background. I think that's so important in the process of knowing ourselves. And I think that's what we have to teach our students too. Like not only just like art making, the process of it being healing with what the pandemic is happening right now, but also just saying like, that's how you're going to know yourself, right? It's to not be afraid to ask those questions, even if it's scary.
Yeah. And I think the hope is with doing this work on ourselves and thinking about that is that we can then maybe empower our students to have those conversations when they're hopefully not, but when they are inevitably in a position like you were in and able to say like, this is about me. Are you asking about me? Are you asking about my work or what's making you uncomfortable here? And it's, I think imagining my 18-year-old self having a conversation like that is laughable, but I'm hoping that having these conversations as like a 12-year-old will empower them in the future.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's that mix too of when I think about it, it's that mixture of evaluating him as teacher, but also evaluating the space I was in holistically. Does that make sense? Like who was in the classroom with me, right? I was one of few inside the classroom in terms of students of color in the space. And so I wonder if that would have changed, because I know when I was sharing that work with like my friends who weren't in art school, right, who are complete SIs, were like, oh, dude, that's so cool. Like how interesting, right? Like there was this relatability. But, I think it's a learning process in the end when those things happen. But I think it's experiences like that keep me wanting to do the adding voices work, if that makes sense, right? It's the fact that I want someone to lean into discomfort and feel comfortable in the discomfort, right? To feel comfortable being like, I'm going to be uncomfortable for a moment, but this is going to be this huge growth experience. But everyone comes from a different standpoint, right? Like for me, white supremacy wasn't something like, indoctrinated at home. Like I'm first generation on one side. And so when I think about like my experience, right? Like my mom's from Mexico City and I came, they came over here my brother and I were born here. And when I think about the art that was in my home and my parents being teachers, they were doing that decolonization, right? Like they were decentering whiteness. They were like, I got in trouble being like, Columbus is not a nice man, right? I got in trouble at school. Like, I was like, he is not a good person. Like he has problems. Like, missions are not happy places in terms of California history, right? Or saying without Africa, and specifically without certain exhibits that happen, right? People being exhibited, African masks being exhibited, like Picasso wouldn't be Picasso, right? Like Guernica could never, the movement of those pieces or the way masks were used, like Cubism itself, right? Like where that comes from. I was lucky to have parents who were trying to teach me those things. Granted, still in school, right? Those things happen because, you're trying to cope with either aspects of assimilation or unfortunately like whiteness, right? Like even in art class. So I don't know. I'm excited for what we're doing. I still can't believe Sydney and I became friends the way we did with Rebecca. Even meeting you, I'm like, what? Somebody wants me to be on a podcast? Like, that's so weird. Like, I just doing my thing inside my class, right? Like the classroom here is like, I'm going to do my thing in the classroom, and then here you go.
But I love how it's blossomed from that entire background. Like, I feel like it's from the childhood you're talking about, that is coming into what you're doing. And now you're able to share that with people who didn't have that. Maybe people like that professor who, needed some professional development and needed like somebody to say, hey, look, here are some amazing artists that you should know about. Here's like some context and how you can talk about them. And like, here's some really good questions that you should be asking yourself. And here's some really good questions you should be asking your students. Being able to share that and spread that is just incredible. So yeah, what you guys are doing is amazing. And anyone listening should sign up and support Adding Voices and go see what they're doing. Check out these lessons.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a labor of love, I think, for Sydney and I, but it's also exhausting. Like it's a really hard medium to not overwork when it's something we love and having to almost be aware of when that's happening. But we also geek out. Like it'll be like us on Zoom like this, right? And like picture like baby and like, picture like a lot of stuff happened over here. Dog on the other side with Sydney. Like, we're like, this idea, like, okay, like, yeah, who is that artist? And then we're like, it'd be really good. We got to find, she's like, I have it, so it's just like this back and forth, this synergy that happens.
That's beautiful.
And we'll go like, I have an hour, then the baby needs to eat and I need to, and then it's like 6 hours later and we're like sweating and haven't eaten all day.
Not good. Yeah. So we changed like how often, like, when you were asking about the conference and like how often it's going to be, it's just this realization of like, the goal is sustainability, right? Like, I think I said that with the first conference. It's like, the work that we're doing needs to be sustainable. It's hard and it's about consistency. And, teacher burnout is real, especially with Zoom, especially within the conditions that we're all in this pandemic, like all of it. So you think when you put that in context, you're like, how can we, like I said, the pot, like how can we make sure to like feed and nourish teachers who want to grow? How do we make sure the evolution continues, but that it's sustainable? Because I don't want to lose my students, right? Like I don't want to be at a place where I can't be who I need to be for them, just as much as like for my family, right? And the same thing for Sydney. So we were like, okay, all right. So we had like that first inaugural, like, whoa, amazingness that happened. I can't still believe that. It was like 40 people. And then I blinked and George Floyd, was murdered. And then all of a sudden I was up to like over 400 people attending the conference. And then people signing up, and it's just like me with a website, and then like people sending me like messages, and I'm like trying to do that while like nursing the baby, like it's a whirlwind. But it was so cool that it happened. Like I'm still in shock over what has occurred. Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think that's been a big thing this last couple months is that we've been trying to slow down and look at the work that we've been doing and plan for the future to create that sustainable future and focus on community. And where at first it was just like, let's do this. And just putting our whole selves in. And then the school year starts and it's like, we've talked about that. So that's kind of what we've been focused on is reflecting and planning. And
yeah,
because it's that aspect of play, right, Rebecca? Like that's the fun part, right? When you're just in that play or the marination station where you're like, this would be so great. And I was like, do you want to do a newsletter? And then I remember when I shared my idea for the newsletter with Denise, she's like, I think Like, this is way cooler than what I thought it was going to be. And I was like, oh, yay, like, cool. Like, but we can't stay up that late and, the rest of it. And I don't want to say perfectionists, but we have an eye for detail. And we also are about things being aesthetically pleasing, right? And feeling the materiality and things. So we take a lot of time to design, like, since for me, even designing the website for Adding Voices. So it's one of those things where you're like, let's keep it sustainable and also accessible, right? Like, we don't want our content level to go down because we're tired.
Right.
So this year will probably be like first year, and then we might take a year off just so we can listen, assess, and then have another year with the conference.
Yeah.
Year off of
the conference.
Yeah.
Conference of Adding Voices in terms of the Patreon. Everybody.
We do have dreams of some like smaller community, like jam session kind of stuff.
Yeah.
In the interim.
Like symposium, maybe. That's what we're thinking.
Yeah. Just some place to connect without it becoming
too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like we're thinking maybe it's two of us right now every other year and bring on more people. But we really do. It is really important to us to find a way to connect with people and hear from people and learn from each other in that in between time.
Yeah, that's amazing. I would like to kind of give you a couple of just wrapping up questions. So this one is one of my favorite questions because it's just totally open-ended and you can answer individually or collectively. What are you curious about right now?
I would say I'm curious about what the art world will look like in another year. I'm curious how the museum is going to change because the museum is not a neutral space. So I'm very curious beyond the fact I miss museums. And then just what teaching is going to look like now in a way, right? When I think about all the ways of like, especially as art teachers, but teachers in general, how many materials we touch and our students, and yeah, flu season. And yes, we used to clean, I cleaned everything, but I just, I'm curious what, I guess in those two ways, I'm curious like what museums will teach into.
You kind of sparked this curiosity, I guess, Flavia. And not that it hasn't been something I've thought about, but just the way you put it was beautiful, like everything you say. But just thinking about our artists at school and the work that they're going to make, but even like in the next year, like even when we are back together, what that work looks like and what collaboration looks like. And I guess I'm just curious to see not just the teaching side and like the logistics, but like the work that they're making. And thank you, Flavia, for answering the question for me.
I mean, right? Like it's one of those things where you think about it and we're asking just to be so resourceful and you're thinking like, okay, I'm doing that as an adult, right? But I'm asking you as a very young student to be so imaginative, right? With materials in an era where technology is so prevalent, right? So then it's like, I'm asking you to kind of go back and be an 80s kid, right? Like I'll be like, yeah, there's a TV there or whatnot, but like, you can't DVR everything. It's like, it's on when it's on. Do you know what I mean? Like there's some aspect to that, I mean, I'm more of a 90s. I was born in the 80s. I'm all a 90s.
Me too.
But like, it just makes me think about that. It's just interesting, the perception of the world and then how they're going to interact in general. I'm curious about social dynamics in general. Like, how do we interact? Like, what's inside? What is outside now? Like, what will be dining? Like, will we eventually actually go back inside of places,
And you said you have, Rebecca, a kindergartner, and Flavia, you have a 4-year-old, and I work with those ages and just thinking about students experiencing school for the first time on Zoom. And they're like, that's their school now. Like they get up and they get ready. And I mean, I'm saying this all from a teacher perspective, but they know where the mute button is and it's just like, this is school for them. So I'm interested to see what that will look like when we're back on campus and if there are some, I guess, positive changes that will come from that. Cause I can think of a lot of things that are going to be really hard, but I'm really curious about the positives that are going to come out of that. Cause we've found really creative ways to connect. I've found a lot of games to play with students and like, sometimes we're doing these virtual hugs and I can feel them cause we're like very, into hugs and kindergartners are too. So.
I'm curious when I'll actually meet up with Sydney in person. That's another one. I'm curious when I'll actually see her without a mask. Like, right? Like I'm going to see her and be like, "Hi, you." Like, yeah. But okay, they're good questions. You have good questions.
Those were all good questions. Now I'm curious about all of that too.
Okay, a really fun, just like little question. So I had, what's your go-to order at your favorite restaurant? And I've shifted this in some interviews because I feel like there's so many levels of like issue with it, as it's classist in some ways. It's a question that's also like hits me on a different level because I haven't been to a restaurant since last March. And like, you know, a lot of people haven't or even done takeout. Like we've been so careful that we're just like, we're cooking.
Okay, I applaud that. That's incredible. Yeah, we are like, I have to have a break because I'm going to go bananas.
I mean, my husband cooks more than I do.
Mine too.
So maybe it's better to ask, like, what's your favorite food?
Yeah, food's hard for me because I have celiac disease, so that's pretty limiting. And then
So there's another.
Yeah. And so restaurants are really hard.
Say what you like though, right, Sid? Like, what's your favorite food?
No, but but I get the restaurant complication that like you'd think like, oh, easy, fun end of interview question, but then it's like, but what about this?
Yeah. I feel like that's great though that you're asking that, you know, like that you're analyzing the questions, right? Because I feel like that's where our learning and unlearning keep coming, right? We're taught that all these things are like non-taboo, so to speak, right? Or are harmless or, you know, are open-ended. And then we keep like learning them.
Totally.
You know, and learning on them. That's cool. Okay, Sid, what's your favorite thing to eat? I don't know this yet, so I'm curious. Something new.
So my GI, I had a phone appointment. My gastroenterologist the other day said, "Are you still eating spicy Cheetos?" And my answer was, yes, for breakfast this morning. And by the way, like I also have GERD and I'm trying to stop eating spicy foods. So spicy Cheetos, you know,
for breakfast.
You know, you get up and then all of a sudden you're on Zoom with 25 4-year-olds and it's like I'm turning off my camera and eating a Cheeto in between.
Well, that was like a snack. Are we calling? Okay,
no
first
rules.
of all, are we now calling hot Cheetos a food as I moved into food group? Okay, because I'm just messing with you. Okay, I'm just messing. No, well, it's really funny. My favorite food is probably breakfast. Like I can eat breakfast any time of the day. I'm particularly a fan of chocolate chip pancakes if we're going with my absolute favorite. Yeah. Otherwise snacking, I don't know. That's harder.
I can help you with that.
No, I mean like I like lots of snacks. I love it. My favorite, Sydney. I love it. Thank you, friend. But no, I love snacks. I'm just trying to think of what Oreos. Okay, Oreos. I'm like I can put away like a row too quickly, probably. Or Girl Scout cookies. Those are Thin Mints. Okay, I digress. Yeah. So anyway, look at you. So he's like la 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 la.
I can't.
La, la, la,
well, I can't talk about Girl Scout cookies because those are one of those things that like I can't eat.
Ooh. So Oreos.
Oreos. I can eat gluten-free Oreos.
Okay, gluten-free Oreos. Yeah. Okay, Oreos. I really enjoy your podcast. Thank you for creating them.
Oh, thank you.
We need that.
We do.
As teachers to hear.
We're like talking over each other. Yeah. So Sydney and I do this a lot. It's actually not talking over each other. It's sort of like finishing each other's sentences. But like we need that as teachers because go, Sydney.
I think especially in a pandemic, you can feel really alone in your experience. And so that's why Flavia and I are texting about lessons all day. It's like, is this just me? And it's not. For any of you, it's not.
Yeah.
So it's nice to hear because you're going to connect with something everyone says. Because teaching, I feel like, you know, is teaching.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. This was really fun. Like talk about a lovely evening that I did not, you know, like, I mean, I knew I had an interview and I was nervous, but we had an interview, but yeah, this was great.
Yeah. Well, I'm also always nervous still. I'm like still really nervous whenever I do this.
You did great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great questions.
Is there anyone that you would want to thank or give like a shout out to?
I feel like if Flavia wasn't on here, I'd be like, shout out to Flavia, you know, because she's like my co-conspirator in life. Like, but also I have the other art teacher, Emily, who works at the school that I'm at, or at Miss Morton, the students call her. She and I have been able to collaborate more than we ever have before and have both felt so grateful for that because it can just feel so overwhelming. So having friends who are art teachers and having coworkers that you can share this experience with, I think has been really important to my other art teacher friends, Maddie and Deb, and just, you know, that community. Lots of love.
That community is so important. I totally agree. great. In general, I think I'm really grateful for my chair. He's incredible. So that's Joe Medina. Thank you for teaching me and always pushing me to share my ideas and to do the things that I'm scared of. And then definitely to Jennifer Gabriel. She's the person who helped me run that conference. Like, she was the one who I said, how do I run a conference? Like, how do you even do that? And she was the person who just said, oh, like, I used to run conferences. This is what you do. And without that, I wouldn't have been able to do that by myself. Like, it was literally just me and like my friend choosing to talk to me. Jahan Giles for her wisdom and consistent support. Yeah. And the family. I think I can't do that without them. And my kids always reminding me that there's beauty in the world, because I think I really need that during the darkness of what exists. So like, I think my family is like really key in that. I don't think I'd do what I don't think I'd have the same fire sometimes, some days, you know what I mean, without them. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I wouldn't eat a lot of days without my husband. So there's also
real talk husbands.
Gratitude there.
Yeah, gratitude there. Gratitude to them.
Yes.
That's true too. I wouldn't be able to talk to you right now without a baby like bouncing and me multitasking right now if he wasn't doing that. Which I just think dads should do their part and be parents, just to like clarify that in context. But I'm appreciative of the fact that there is respect and no just like care. It's important. Yeah.
And last thing, where can listeners connect with you online?
Ooh, okay. So you could go to Adding Voices on Patreon. That's overall to see like what we do and to subscribe. Then there's the Adding Voices Instagram. And Sydney and I both kind of take care of that, but we also have our own Instagram. So I have mine. I don't know if I should say all that out loud. My brain's tired, but yeah.
You can if you want to. I'll link to everything too. So
at Flavia ZW_HW, I think is it. I'm tired. So you see my face. My face was like squinting while I did that. Yeah. And then Sydney has hers.
My Instagram is Sydney Teaching Art. And then my website is justsydneysnyder.com.
Awesome.
Oh, and then I have Blaxican Mama where my artwork is.
I will link to everybody.
There's an Adding Voices website, but like the up-to-date stuff that's coming out regularly is Patreon and Instagram are probably the best.
Exactly.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thanks for taking so much time.
Thank you for having us.
We do virtual hug.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can reach me at Teaching Artist Podcast on Instagram or teachingartistpodcast@gmail.com. Who do you want to hear from? Please share your recommendations of teaching artists. And if you loved this episode, please subscribe, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow me. It really makes a big difference. Thank you.